It's extreme wrestling and eyeglass chains. It's the outdated wrestling hour. Hello, everybody. My name is Bob Smith. You might remember me from my days with Pro Wrestling Illustrated magazine, WCW magazine, and a bunch of others. But right now, I am like a kid in a candy store. My guest tonight is someone I've tried to get on the show for a long time, and I finally had the courage to ask, and he said yes, and I couldn't believe it. It's Dave Burzyinski. You may know him better as Dave Supermouth Drason, the former manager of the Sheik. That's the original Sheik, folks. The villainous, infamous, legendary Sheik. And we're going to talk about old times. That's it. I am so enamored of this guy. He was a photographer. I have a kindred spirit thing going on with anybody who worked for the wrestling magazines, just like I did. I don't know. I feel like we're part of a community. And he did it when he was 12 years old. You're going to hear all about him, his history. If you've never heard of him, be prepared for a very fascinating story of a guy who worked his way up to become the manager for the biggest heel in the wrestling business. Incredible. So we're going to take a little break. We're going to have our usual ad, and then here comes Dave Burzyinski, the Supermouth. You're going to love this one. We'll be right back. This is going to be great.
Ladies and gentlemen, Wrestling Fans International Association is back. That's right, the premier fan club association of the 1970s and 1980s has been revived and is back in business. Join today. It's free at thewfia.org. That's thewfia.org. You can also join us on Facebook at facebook.com/groups/WFIA 1969.
Folks, I have to tell you, this is one of my big moments as a wrestling podcaster. The same way it was when, in year one, about 6 or 7 episodes in, I got the opportunity to interview Terry Sullivan, famous for being a ring announcer and also a color commentator on the old Big Time Wrestling program. And then he went on to work in Indiana for Dick the Bruiser and had a wonderful wrestling career. Now he's still doing it. I want to interview another guy who's still doing it in a way, somebody I admire greatly for 1,000 different reasons. Number one, just like me, he worked for the wrestling magazines and he took fantastic photos as a ringside photographer in the Detroit area. And I'm going to get to the bottom of all this as we talk. He's written for Slam Wrestling and the WFIA newsletter and on it goes. And he and Terry Sullivan do an incredible series of videos on YouTube that I hope he'll talk about with me. And on top of all that, at the height of the man's powers, he was the manager as Dave Supermouth Drason of the one and only Sheik, who still holds an amazing mystique over me all these years later, because it took me years to finally see him on videotape because of the territorial system that we had back in the day. And I got 1,000 questions for him. Folks, it's Dave Burzyinski, a wrestling legend if I've ever met one. Dave, I am so proud to have you on this show.
Bob, thanks for having me on here. Man, I've never got that kind of props before. Man, what an introduction. Thank you very much.
Well,
much appreciated.
I always feel a kindred spirit with other wrestling photographers and writers, because we all kind of started out the same way. I fluked doing a job with PWI, and I know how hard it was. When you got into wrestling photography, were you a staff photographer for Big Time Wrestling. How did that all work out? How'd you get started?
Well, it all goes back into the late 50s. Up my upstairs neighbor, we had a 2-story house on the east side of Detroit, and my parents rented out the upstairs flat that we had to Leaping Larry Shane, who was probably the most popular babyface in Detroit at that time. And it's like, I had no idea who he was until one day my parents said, "Hey, watch wrestling on Saturday afternoon and you'll see Larry upstairs." And I saw this and it's like, holy crap. I mean, I got a legend living upstairs from me. And it's like from there on, it's like, Larry on his off days or before he was going to, shots, in the territory, he'd play catch with me, baseball outside, and we'd sit and talk on the porch. And, that was my introduction into professional wrestling. And then it was in 1961. I was 6 years old. And one day, Larry asked my mother if he could take me to the studio wrestling at WXYZ Channel 7 Studios here in Detroit. And my mother says, sure. And the thing I remember most about that, I don't remember the matches or anything like that because, they were only a 1 hour long, of course, and it went by so fast. But the thing I remember is when we came into the TV studio, Larry's carrying his bag and I'm by his side. And out of one of the side doors comes Ricky the Crusher Cortez. And that was like Larry's biggest nemesis at the time. And I saw him come out of this doorway and I knew who he was. And, when you're a 6-year-old kid, these, wrestlers look like monsters to you, and I was just scared to death. Oh no, they're going to start fighting right here in the hallway, and, it didn't happen. Ricky, shot back into the room and, we went on and, that was my introduction into, really wrestling then, besides watching it on TV. But then in 1964, I followed, Larry's career and stuff. I never went to another show. But in 1964, he was killed in a, car crash coming back home, to Detroit, and, from that day on, it's like, well, there goes my wrestling thing. But then it was like one Saturday afternoon in July of 1964. Friends of mine were out there playing baseball. And, one day, we're playing and it got to about 5:00 and these guys go, "Hey, we got to go." And it's like, go? We're playing baseball. It's going to be light until 9:00. He says, "No, we're going down to Cobo Arena for wrestling." Go, really? And they go, "What, you want to go with us?" Man, I couldn't run home fast enough to get a couple dollars from my mom to get, seats up in the yellow, nosebleed seats at Cobo Arena, enough for a hot dog and a program, and I took my brownie camera with me, those little square box brownie cameras. And the first thing I remember is Killer Carl Cox, getting into the ring, holding the ring ropes, and he looks up into the crowd. And I could have swore he was looking at me and giving me a dirty look. And it sent shivers through my body, and it's like probably the first guy wrestler I really hated. And that night, I'm taking pictures from up, there with my camera. And it's the first time I used my mother's camera like that. So when the show was over, I opened up the camera, took the film out to see what the pictures looked like. And I had no idea you had to take the film in to get developed. So my very first pictures that I ever took at wrestling, destroyed. So from there on, I just never missed a show, kept on going. And then it's like, I went down, my first ringside seats were in the second row. So there was times I was able to get some good shots here and there, but hey, I was like a 10-year-old kid, so a little, my photographs are a little fuzzy and far away. And one Christmas, I asked my mother for a better camera, and I got a 35 millimeter camera. And from there on, the pictures started coming out better. I would hang out back by the dressing rooms, and when guys would come out or something, to get a coffee or something, talk to other fans, I, took pose pictures of them up against the wall. And then it's like, my photography in wrestling started to get better.
Mm-hmm.
And then I, sent a few of the photographs to Wrestling Review, Lou Eskin. And, he's, they bought him, right on the spot. And, I got there was in Wrestling Review back in I say this was 1967, that they had a little sections in there called Action in, and a city.
Right.
And so, so they had the Action in Detroit, and it was my photographs, and I got $25.
Oh, man. You know something for that day, that time period, that's good money.
For a kid, yeah.
Yeah.
And so the story goes like this. So I'm, sending in photographs almost every month. So Lou Eskin, says, well, I can use this one. I can use, I can't use this. We can't have all Detroit in here all the time. And, we, just sending, snail mail letters back and forth. He says, well, whenever you're in New York, stop by the office and see me. So I took that as an invite. So now this is 1967. So I was 12 years old. I flew to New York, took the bus down into Manhattan, found their offices. I think it was on Fifth Avenue and 25th or something like that. So I found the building, and I go upstairs, and I go into the office, and the secretary sitting there, and says, yeah, I'm here to see Lou Eskin. He says, and you are? I said, Dave Burzyinski. So she calls him on the intercom, and send him right in. So I walk in the office, and Lou Eskin, the look on his face when he sees this 12-year-old kid, it's like, you're Dave Burzyinski? And he's thinking I'm like a 20, 30-something-year-old person.
Mm-hmm.
And then, I started, writing more and more. And he told me, this was the best part of it, is that, he said, if you write a story behind your photographs, you get paid more. So I would start interviewing, wrestlers, oh my God, I did so many stories like the Love Brothers and, Johnny Valentine and, I can't even begin to think of all the ones that I wrote.
Mm-hmm.
But then I was getting $50 for the stories and the photographs. So for a 12-year-old kid, man, it was great.
Something from your work, you never would have known it. Your age. I mean, seriously, I remember seeing your early work, and I never thought you were that young.
I don't know what to say, but, it's the same thing with, my sort of, writing and photography thing really took a turn in 1966, when they had local gal here, Dawn Porter and Dave Alexander. They really didn't work for Big Time Wrestling, but they were fans who were connected. And they held a fan convention down in Cincinnati. And it's I found out about this. Well, I saw them at the matches and they told me about it. So I got a Greyhound bus ticket, went down to Cincinnati and went to this fan convention. And that's where I met, first and foremost, Jim Fanning, who's now known as Handsome Jimmy Valiant. And that's before he started wrestling. And I met Don and Judy Wilson, who really, I can't say enough of what they did for me in my wrestling life and, personal life as a kid. They took me in and, they said the same kind of thing. Hey, if ever you're in St. Louis, come and, stay with us. So I did. This is 1967. I went to St. Louis, stayed with them. They took me to the Kiel Auditorium. That's the first time I saw matches, under Sam Muchnick's promotion. and we became good friends. And they came to Detroit for this other same, Dawn Porter, group, 1967 fan convention that was held in Detroit. And it's like, Don sort of took it personal because fans didn't get to vote for the wrestlers who were getting the awards. The awards were given by, favoritism, from, Dawn Porter and Dave Alexander and a couple other people that were on the end. So Don, said, hey, let's start our own organization where, fans vote and stuff. And that's how the WFIA got started in late 1967. And from right off the get-go, they asked me if I would be on their board of directors. And it's like, a board of director, I don't know what the heck that is. I'm 12 years old. But, I learned so much about wrestling then. And then I'm meeting fans from all over the country, not only St. Louis, but like Atlanta and LA and Kansas City and, Tom Burke on the East Coast, Diane Devine and Danny Goddard and, just, so many others. And it's like we would trade programs and photographs and, back in the day, you didn't have the internet or, stuff like that. You were doing snail mail, sending stuff through the mail. And, I was collecting stuff, all those programs and photographs and mine, passing them back and forth. And from there on, WFIA was holding conventions in cities all over the country every year. And it's like I was involved, with Don, helping him set him up. And, over the years, I got to be the MC at a few of the, conventions, and I was involved. And, it was just a magical time for a wrestling fan, at the height of, really wrestling in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah. There was nothing like 70s wrestling. That's where I cut my teeth. I became a fan in 1970. We had... I lived in the Albany, New York area, and for some reason, Pedro Martinez was promoting there. I can never figure out why, because it was a long way from Cleveland, a long way from Buffalo. But he was doing regular shots and he had TV there in Albany for about a year and a half. And I loved that show. And I was just older to figure out what wrestling really was at that point, and I was hooked. I remember I talked to Paige Von Hess Sutherland last year, and told her the stories about how Kurt Von Hess is probably the first wrestler that ever frightened me because he had that leering big eyes and that real German look, that's where I cut my teeth on the old NWF then. So I know how you feel. I know what it feels like to be a 12, 13-year-old kid and be just intoxicated with the whole scene. But you were living it at that point.
Yeah, I was really fortunate. Just the thing is that, writing for the wrestling magazines at the time and things, and that's how I made, $50, $100 a month, and my parents, I'd get this money and I'd ask my dad, who owned a grocery store at the time, to cash my check. And he's like, where is this kid getting this money from? But it helped, I'd save my money. And then I would, just through the wrestling community, I would fly to St. Louis, I'd fly to Atlanta, I'd fly to LA, I'd fly to Kansas City. And the friends that I had there, they'd pick me up at the airport. I'd stay at their house. We'd go to wrestling. We'd talk wrestling all weekend. We'd have a good time. And then I'd fly back home. And my parents had no idea that I was gone. I said, hey, I would say that I'm going to spend the weekend at a friend's house. We're going to play baseball and games and stuff like that. And I did this without their knowledge. And, basically, both my parents have, since passed, but they still never found out that, I did this as a young kid.
When you get bit by that bug, you got to do what you got to do, right?
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? It's like once you get the passion for it, once you have an opportunity, you better walk through that door. Because they don't always come along. And I understand why you did what you did, for sure.
I was, still going to matches at Cobo Arena and, had so many other, friends there. And I, along with Alan Cooper, we had the Michigan Scene Fan Club. Harry Sullivan had the Bobo Brazil Fan Club. There was a gal, let's see, Dawn Porter had the Dr. Bill Miller Fan Club. I didn't realize it and think about it until a few years ago when I looked at one of the fan club cards that I had, that I was vice president of the Edouard Carpentier fan club, with Carl Gow. And then Jerry Davidson had the Ivan Kalmakoff fan club. So, the Detroit community of wrestling fans are, we knew all each other, and, we talk in the matches and stuff. And it came to one time where Dick the Bruiser's promotion was coming in and going to run opposition to the Sheik's promotion. And that's when they started bringing in all these heavyweights, from around the NWA, like Gorilla Monsoon and Mil Mascaras and, Buddy Austin, just all these greats that I've never seen them before live, but I knew them through all the wrestling magazines. And they were all going to be at Cobo Hall, for one of these shows. And it's like, oh my God, how can I take pictures of this? So I got the nerve to ask one of the guards to get, somebody from the office, but, because I had my wrestling review press pass. So Joyce Farhat, who I didn't know who she was at the time, she came out, and I told her, I showed her my press card, told her who I was, and, I'm a photographer, and I want to cover this, spectacle at Cobo Arena with all these greats, for the wrestling magazine. So they allowed me to do that, to shoot up at ringside. And the funny thing is like a lot of my friends who were sitting in the first and second row with their cameras and stuff, now they see me up at the ring. It's like, how the heck did they get to do that? And then, the next week I came back, I printed all the pictures out, and I gave them to Joyce, and she says, can we use these for the body press? Because at the time, they didn't have a body press photographer. Right. There was a gentleman before who I adored. His name was Wilson Lindsay. He worked for a local Detroit newspaper, Detroit Free Press, and he was a musician, but he covered, musical acts. He covered like the Rolling Stones when they first came to Detroit. He covered the Beatles at their press conference, but he shot wrestling too. But he, started shooting photographs for Johnny Doyle and Jim Barnett when they owned the promotion prior to the Sheik. And when the Sheik bought the promotion and his son, Eddie Farhat Jr., came into the picture, Eddie Farhat Jr. and Wilson Lindsay didn't get along. And Wilson just stopped taking pictures at Cobo Arena. So they really, were using older photographs for the program at the time. So once I came into the picture, they started using mine. So that was a great coup for me. And then it came to where I think it was Eddie Farhat Jr., Bob Finnegan, Terry Sullivan, who was now working, for the office at the time too. They would write some of the articles. Well, they didn't have time enough all the time to be writing them. And I says, well, I'm a writer. I'll write the articles. So every 2 weeks, and then it became, when Cobo was doing shows every week, I was doing like 10 articles a week on my little typewriter, just typing out these outrageous stories, whatever would come into this, 14, let's see, I think I was 14, 15 when I first started, shooting photographs for them. So these bizarre ideas for these wrestlers that would come in my mind, that's what I was writing for the body press. So I was taking the photographs, writing the articles for it, and life was just wonderful. And then I started, getting to know more of the guys because I'm in the dressing room all the time. And then I got to travel with them. There's times I'm with, could be Bull Curry and Bobo Brazil and Tony Marino. We're Great Kabuki. We're driving up to Toronto for a show after a Cobo show. when Andre the Giant first came to the territory, I had a big Ford LTD, and Sheik asked me if I'd drive him around. So every show for 2 weeks, I'm driving Andre the Giant everywhere.
Yeah.
So, I got to know so many of these guys, and it was like, I can interview them, and, they took me in as a young kid, and, life was just, it couldn't have been better for me, in the wrestling world.
And for the sake of my listeners, I just want to state one thing. You talked about when Bruiser was kind of breathing down the throats of the Sheik's promotion. At that point, the Cobo Arena cards, and I see them printed all the time on Facebook. People have those old pages from the programs. They were the most star-studded 11 or 12 match cards I have ever seen written out. I have never seen such an array of talent from all over the wrestling world, all in the same place, and they were all converging on Cobo Arena. That really was a magical time to be there.
Oh, yeah. I've been posting those for a long time now on my Facebook group page. I think it's called 50s, 60s, 70s Big Time Wrestling.
Right.
So if anybody's on Facebook, look that up and, join our group. I put so much memorabilia of mine up there. Like, I could do videos because, whenever me and Terry did our Big Time Memory show, I posted that up there. I post, the lineup sheets, from years gone by. I post photographs that have never been seen before, the body press covers, whatever, encompass the Detroit wrestling scene, that's on our Facebook page.
Incredible. It is I am a member. I have a fuzzy memory now because I'm in awe of whom I'm talking with, ladies and gentlemen. But you're right. I'm a member of that group, and you got to check that out. Oh man, there's nothing I enjoy more about Facebook's wrestling community than the people who post the old match results and the old clippings and the old newspaper ads and stuff. That I always enjoy it every time I see it.
And the thing about that, people like yourself who see these lineups and they see the amount of talent that came in and out of here, for years, as opposed to when I see stuff from like the East Coast at the same time frame,
right.
Bruno, Pedro Morales, and, all the top guys, but from the middle card down, it was the same guys, just intertwined every show. So, a lot of new talent really wasn't coming into the East Coast, even though everybody says, but, how New York was the greatest and stuff. But I think in wrestling fans' minds, whatever territory they grew up in,
is right.
That's their, best, wrestling.
And, I miss the days when everybody thought their champion, where they lived, was the world champion. It was better then. I'm telling you, it was better then. Because it didn't matter if you were watching a studio show in Cleveland. You thought Johnny Powers was the world champion. Because that's what you saw. That's what you knew. That's what you were watching.
Yep.
And it worked like gangbusters. That's another reason why I missed the innocence of the territory days. They weren't the promoters weren't hornswoggling the fans. They were promoting their own stuff. It was just a whole different mindset back then. And no matter where you lived, that was your champion, as they used to say. And I miss that whole vibe. I really do.
I'll tell you what I miss the most, and it's hard for me and probably for a lot of the old school wrestling fans to really embrace what the product is on TV now. And I'll tell you what I think the difference is, the main difference, besides the fact that you don't know the difference between a heel and a baby face anymore, because really the heels are the baby faces. You can't tell. But what's missing from wrestling today, from our era and stuff, is characters. I mean, when I say characters, I mean, you had the cowboys, the Indians, the doctors, the, the masked guys, the Arabs, the Japanese, the Germans, which that, you created, this world of professional wrestling for, fans to go and hate and to love, which now I can't name one character that's in professional wrestling right now. I mean, if you consider Roman Reigns or CM Punk as a character, oh man, they'd be opening up the show back in the day.
Well, I will say this. The name of this podcast is the Outdated Wrestling Hour, right? Because I'm outdated. I'm old enough. I like to look back a lot, and that was the whole theme of this is to pay tribute to the stars and the moments that I grew up watching. Even though I had a history with the wrestling magazines later, I still very romantic about my kid life watching wrestling. Now, the difference in wrestling then versus now, to me, and we talk about this on the show a lot. When you and I were kids, we would turn on our television or go to the arena to watch our favorite wrestler beat that bad guy because he did something bad on television. And he needs to be stopped. Right?
Yeah.
Today, a young wrestling fan goes to a wrestling match and he's booking the match along with the promoter. He's saying this guy isn't being used right, or this guy isn't being put over. He got pinned, so they're wasting him. The door has been flung open on the secret society of pro wrestling so wide that everybody knows everything and everybody thinks they're as smart as the promoters are. And I find it to be wholly unsatisfying to have that mindset. It's like the kids don't know what they're missing now. I mean, when they flung the doors open around 1992, when the WWE admitted it was predetermined to the New Jersey State Athletic Commission, that made national news that the WWF admitted it was fake. That's when everything changed, in my mind's eye. I was with the magazines at the time. I remember Stu Sachs, the editor-in-chief, looking at the paper I brought in the New York Times with that headline, WWE admits wrestling is fake or something like that. And he just sat there white-faced with his jaw hanging down because he couldn't believe what he was reading. It was the first sign that they're just going to come out and admit this was all a show. And you know what? I don't know if I'm making any sense, but it's like it seems like people watch wrestling for an entirely different reason now than they did when you and I were kids. That's all I'm saying.
Well, here's another way I can equate it that, fans listening to your show, can maybe understand more about it. What if you went to, just say, Vegas or, you're, anywhere in your own town or something, and you went to see a magic show.
Mm-hmm.
But now you know how all the tricks are done. So what's the thrill in sitting there and paying, X amount of dollars to watch a magic show when you know how it's done?
Good point. Yeah.
And then, and these days, mercy's sake, you've got these, pay-per-views and stuff, from WWE that, they're charging fans, front rows and stuff like that. Oh, you get to take the seat home, but it costs you $10,000 for a seat.
Yeah.
But they're always sold out.
That's the thing.
Those same people that go to there, either the parents who can afford it or pay for it and stuff, they're probably the first ones to be, bitching about gas prices and grocery prices and everything else.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see them complaining about the prices of wrestling tickets.
I always say sports tickets are too expensive as I stare at a sold out arena or a baseball stadium. So what do I know, right? It's like I'm complaining, but everybody's there. So how is it too expensive when the place is full? People are finding the money one way or another. I don't know where they're getting it from, but holy smokes. I don't know what I saw a graph of what WrestleMania tickets are upcoming in Philadelphia. My jaw dropped. It was like, I don't believe what I'm seeing here. $1,700, $1,800 and stuff. I'm like, oh. I remember standing in line at the Washington Avenue Armory in Albany to get my coveted ringside seat, and it was $6, and they sold it to me out of a cigar box.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Probably the little yellow ticket with a number on the side.
Exactly right. And it's most wrestling promotions were like that back then in the territory days. And you know what? I still thought it was big time. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Now let me ask you this, Bob. What are your memories? Because here in the Detroit area, and I've been fortunate to see a lot of these stars. And my favorite, once I switched over, because I was a big fan of Mark Lewin and Bobo Brazil.
Okay.
Until, I switched over to the heel side,
Mhm.
And the Sheik has always been my favorite ever since then. And, I was so fortunate to work for the guy, travel with them. And the biggest thrill of my wrestling life is, I got to manage the Sheik.
Right.
Be it late in his career, but I still had that opportunity. He was still, the Syrian madman.
Before you
So
before you ask me what you're going to ask me, let's segue into just that. Because I know
Okay.
you were well respected in the locker room for your photography. I remember, there were pictures of you showing off your photos to the Sheik and things like that, and it looked like you were established within that locker room. How did that segue into you actually becoming a manager? Were you talkative? Did you have a gift of gab? Did they say, "Hey, we can put this to use"? How that? Because I know how secretive the Sheik was. From talking to Terry Sullivan too, and I have my own Sheik anecdote coming up later. But he was he lived his role as the Sheik every moment of every day. He never strayed from "I am the Sheik," and that's all there is to it. So my question to you is, how the heck did you worm your way into becoming a manager when things were so strict and very, very hard to get into that business, even for wrestlers? How did you do it?
Well, first and foremost, when I was, the photographer and stuff at Kobo, growing up as a kid, I was always razor thin. I always say, you put a white hat and white boots on me, I look like a giant Q-tip, you know. But, I only weighed 142 pounds. So I had never had an aspiration of being a wrestler at all. I just knew it wouldn't happen because I just didn't have the physical, body for it and the weight for it. But the managers always caught my eye. I loved listening, to promos that were cut by Abdullah Farouk,
Mhm.
George Cannon, Gary Hart, all those guys. And it's like, God, that I could do that, and I always said I wanted to do it. I wanted to do it. And then once I was, pretty well entrenched at, with the Sheik and, the promotion, I said to the Sheik one time, I would like to be a manager. And it's like at that time, this is 1973, 1974. There was you name me one manager in the wrestling world that was that young. I can never think of one. So anyway, Sheik, he'll let me take this little kid under my wing. So what he, did with me is like when we would, after a Kobo show, either in the dressing rooms, we'd be there late at night, or the next day we'd go to the office in Williamston and we'd shoot promos for the whole territory. Not only Detroit, but we do Cincinnati, Dayton, Toledo, Canton, Akron, just the whole territory. We'd cut promos. So, a bunch of the boys would be there and they'd cut their promo and, work, promote their matches against, whoever. And then at the very end, the Sheik would, have me, he'd pick out a guy like Hank James or Killer Brooks or Ben Justice. He'd, put them with me and he says, okay, cut a 2-minute promo with this guy. And he'd give me this scenario. Okay, you're going against, this guy. Okay, camera on, 2 minutes. So I do one or two sometimes. And then when we were done, we'd go into the, TV truck and he'd replay it and he'd watch me and he would critique it. Okay, you did this right. Okay, here, you're really not getting, across to the fans what you should. You have to get under their skin, so they can, want to see you come, to the show and put their butts in the seats. That's your job. You're talking for your guy to make him larger than life and, more, how can I say, bigger than life, to where the fans shouldn't believe what you're saying and they, don't want to believe it, but you're trying to prove to them, what you're saying. And that's, what he tried to instill in me. And 1974, October 9th, 1974, he gave me my first opportunity to manage beautiful Ben Justice. We went against Tony Marino, and the first thing he did is like a couple weeks before, he, had me do a promo, and he had me under a mask, and he called me the Scholar. And he did that because fans knew me for years as this, young photographer at Kobo.
Yeah.
It's like, all of a sudden he's a manager. How believable is that? So I did my, first 3 shows with him, with Ben Justice, over a course of like 4 days. We did Pontiac, Michigan was my first. I think we did Kalamazoo and Muskegon was my first 3 shows. And then it's like, I came back, Kobo shows the next week. I'm back up at the ringside, shooting pictures and, right in the body press still. And this went on and on. And that's like, when am I going to get my opportunity? And you don't want to bug the Sheik about it.
Right. Can't even imagine.
I knew better than that.
Right.
And then it came at one time, late 1974, Killer Brooks, Tony Marino, Sheik's booker, Jack Kane, Dr. Beach, Carl Von Schatz, a couple other guys, Ben Justice, and Terry Sullivan. They mysteriously didn't show up for a Kobo show one day, and they booked a show in Toledo under their own promotion, the UWA, Universal Wrestling Association. And it's like, at the time, the Sheik was in Japan, and he wasn't on the Kobo show. So when he found out that, a bunch of his guys, went rogue and, had a rival promotion, he cut his, time short in Japan, came straight home, to deal with that. And this is just after he had been dealing, with, Dick the Bruiser's promotion for 3 years, fighting him off.
Right.
So, and I was still with the Sheik at the time, but it came February of 1975. Terry Sullivan called me, and they remembered, Brooks and Marino especially, who were, good friends of mine at the time. They said, hey, let's give this kid a chance. We need a manager here, and he's local. He's ready to go, and they, brought me in. I managed, Blackjack Luca. I managed, Killer Brooks. I managed Ben Justice, and then from years going on, it grew and grew and grew, and it wasn't until years later I was working shows for Sweet Daddy Malcolm Monroe here in Detroit, and I was managing Malcolm Monroe, and I was managing the Kangaroos, which at that time was Al Costello and Mickey Doyle. And it came one show that we had that, the Sheik was booked on the show. And it's like, I go in the dressing room and I see him, and it's like we shook hands and talked and reminisced and blah, blah, blah. And he says, how would you like to go out with me tonight? And it was like, oh my God. I was on like cloud 9. So almost like for the next year and a half, 2 years, and it was sporadic. It wasn't like every week, like, back in the day. But I was managing the Sheik, and it was like, the highlight of my wrestling career.
Sure.
How do you get any better than that?
No, it couldn't. I mean, that is probably one of the most coveted managerial spots. But I'll ask you this question, since of the time frame you're talking about. It would have seemed at the time, once the Dick the Bruiser versus Sheik promotional battle was over, that things would have gotten better. And wasn't that just about the period when things started to get a little worse in terms of attendance and TV problems and things like that? You were there. I mean, it just, I cannot believe, and I read Brian Solomon's book too, and listen to people like you and on your YouTube show with Terry Sullivan about the problems that the promotion started to have right when you would think it would get hotter. It didn't. Why do you think it fizzled the way it did so quickly? Because I'll tell you what, because of the wrestling magazines of the day, I never knew Detroit was anything but the biggest mecca of wrestling in the world. They were covering the Sheik just as hard, 79, 80. It's probably about 1981, whenever that promotion fizzled. So my question to you is, I can't believe it went downhill so fast. How could that have happened? Was it a situation that the Sheik was kind of overdoing the same matches over and over again with himself on top? Was that it? I can't
No,
I can't figure it out.
no, I wouldn't say it was that, because if the Sheik was on the card, especially Cobo Arena or any of the other, bigger, cities around the territory, Sheik's on the card, you're going to have a good crowd.
Right.
When the Sheik wasn't on the show, if he was in Japan, or say he went out to LA or down to Atlanta or something, he's not on the show. Well, now you're cutting your audience by 2,000 to 3,000, So that was the first thing. So you can't blame the Sheik and his, what people say, his matches got stale and stuff. People still came to see him.
Right.
What me and Terry did on one of our episodes of Big Time Memories, we tackled this situation.
Right.
And Terry brought a lot of stuff up that I didn't know about. Besides the Sheik having his mobile TV truck, that's a big expense. Taking that truck and filming, the matches, mainly at Cobo, but he'd take it and shoot them in Toledo and Lima, Ohio sometimes. So there was an expense there. Then you had the expense of the Sheik bought out Pedro Martinez, and now he started running shows beyond Cleveland and Akron and Canton, but he started going into like Western New York, like Rochester and was it Elmira, I think.
Right.
So
Utica probably too. Utica.
Yeah. So the travel for the boys going from, Detroit and, Ohio, where most of them lived, I mean, that's a long drive.
Crazy.
So that's a 6-7 hour drive. Plus now you have to stay at a hotel, and, then they'd have to drive back to another city, probably in Ohio or Ontario, so that was a big expense. Cards, the fans, the crowd started, dwindling at Cobo and stuff, but, the rent didn't go down. The payoffs didn't go down. So there was just so much going on, just little stuff that ate away at the interior of the promotion. So I think that's, why, over time it just dwindled, and, the Sheik was running out of money. I mean, he would have to go to Japan just to try to keep the promotion afloat, because he was making upwards of $5,000 every match, in Japan. So, just say he stayed there for 2 weeks, he's got some good money coming home.
And then he would bring that back and probably sink it into his own promotion, right?
Right. And, I forgot this one. He had built the mansion.
Oh, yeah. I saw that episode, right?
I forgot about that.
Right.
Yeah, that was a big expense, because the office he had was on Grand River Avenue, and like 2 miles up the road, was his original house that he lived in for many years. And then I think it started in 1973 that they started building the mansion, just, a little bit outside of Williamston. And I mean, this place was huge, and, the overruns and the expenses in this house was huge. I mean, I'll go back to one of our episodes on Big Time Memories. Me and Terry went to the mansion, and we filmed an episode there and took, fans through every room of the house, because once the Sheik lost the house, it went up for sale, and then it became a bed and breakfast. Somebody bought it, and it was a bed and breakfast, and they used it for, weddings and, such, and, stuff like that. But now it's up for sale again.
Wow.
So it's not this is in recent time. It's not a bed and breakfast anymore. So, the combination of the mansion, I mean, he just, was spending money more, going out than what they had coming in.
By the way, I will segue just for a moment and tell my listeners, if you don't go onto YouTube and watch Big Time Memories with Terry Sullivan and Dave Drason Burzynski, you are missing out. It is, in my opinion, the finest nostalgia wrestling program on YouTube. You got to see this. And I mean that sincerely. You guys taught me so much. I consider myself a kind of a mini historian. I learned more from you two, you and Terry, than any other program in any venue I've ever seen. It's fantastic. I love it. You got to see this series. It's great. And I want to give a tip of the cap because, gosh, fans, the price is right. You just got to flip to it and check it out. And these biographies of all the stars from Detroit and Mighty Igor and Sheik and Tony Marino, and just go down, Bobo Brazil, go down the list. It is awesome. So I want to tip my cap to you about that.
All right. Thank you very much. Much appreciated. The for the fans, what we did, I mean, we had no idea, going into this, what we were going to do. The Rudy Hill or the Rude Boy, them and Rock's TV, it all started with, they had their wrestling promotion and they were doing their TV show, just for the wrestling. And then Rudy wanted to do a segment, a la Piper's Pit. So he, brought me in and we did Dave Drason's wine cellar, because I'm a lover of wine.
Okay.
And we did the set where we had wine related stuff. And, I was the host and, we did like 5-minute segments and they'd bring in, the wrestlers that they had at the time. And, if they were heel, I would just praise them and, whatever, just put them over, big as I could. And then when you had the baby face on the show, I'm just like belittling him and, so I was the heel kind of thing. So that's how that started. And then for some reason, they came up with this other idea to, tag team me and Terry together. And what they first wanted to do is like, let's do this show where we're doing This Is Your Life on a certain wrestler. So our first episodes, we did Louis Martinez, the Sheik, Bobo Brazil, and Mickey Doyle. So, they turned the camera on and me and Terry, we just started talking, just like two friends talking.
Right.
Just like me and you right now. And that's how it started. And, we gave them, I would tell, give their bio, like when they were born, where they were born, what their real name was. And then, we'd go through the timeline of their wrestling life, how they started, some of their feuds and stuff. And then me and Terry, just along with it, it triggered memories of our personal memories with these guys. And that's how we'd interject these little, vignettes, into the show. And then when we, started doing more and more, we started, more stories and things were just coming out of our, brains that, we had long forgot about.
I'll tell you what, I was genuinely moved by a couple of the episodes. One was when you went back to Kobo. You just go into a building and I was genuinely moved because I could see you two were moved just going back in there. And then when you went and visited the Sheik's mansion one last time, absolutely riveting television. If you ever loved old school wrestling, you've got to check these programs out. I'm telling you, there's nothing else like them. The real story told by the people who were there. What's better than that? Dave, I got to tell you, it's awesome.
And then, not only, because what we did is like all the big stars, the Sheik, Bobo, the Stomper, the Kangaroos, all the, big name talents. But then me and Terry had these little stories about, the lesser guys, like Ivan Kalmakov, he just threw it out one day. We decided to do episodes called Kobo Confidential. It's stuff that's never been told before. And we were just bouncing back off of each other with little ideas. So the very first one, he says, Ivan Kalmakov, tell me a story. And it just triggered a story when I was a kid. My aunt took me to the Detroit Zoo. And we're walking in the Detroit Zoo, and we happen to be going by this dumpsters, and here's a garbage truck. And all of a sudden, I see this guy get off the garbage truck emptying the bins, and it's Ivan Kalmakov. And I was like, Holy crap, wait till I go to Kobo and tell my friends what I just saw. So it's little stories like that, like on, Ivan Kalmakoff and Dr. Jerry Graham and maybe Frankie Lane and, the magnificent Zulu when Zulu, hit Frankie Lane over the head with a pipe. We tell the backstories on that. We tell the backstory and the truth on the mythical Kobo Arena box office robbery that,
oh yeah.
that Eddie Farhad Jr. concocted, which he denied, but Terry Funk, in his book and on YouTube, says it's a true story. For your listeners of the show, you mentioned the YouTube thing, but go to Rox TV,
right.
ROX TV, Big Time Memories, and just scroll through. You'll get like 3-4 episodes, but then something else. Just because it's YouTube, some other things will come. Just keep scrolling. Because we have like 60 some episodes, to date. We're on hiatus right now. We hope to do more. And we've got so many more stories to tell.
Sure do. And I'll tell you what, like I said, I grew up on the wrestling magazine just like everybody else did. I spent my 50-cent allowance on Wrestling World or whatever I could buy. And that's where I learned of the Sheik and the Detroit territory and Toronto and, every place you guys worked. But I didn't get the chance to see them a lot because we were territorial. There was no television. It wasn't like now we can flip a switch and watch any federation. So all these years later, you guys come up with this stuff. And I'm watching that show, and it feels like I'm reading one of my wrestling magazines as a kid. I can give you no greater compliment than that. Because it's like you're telling me stuff I always wanted to know but never knew. Even, I worked in the business for 10 years or 15 years, whatever it was. You're telling me stuff that escaped me because of the time frame and the fact that I was young when this was all going on. But it's stuff I always wanted to know. So it's invaluable to anybody who wants to learn more about, the history of that region. You got to check out Rox TV and Big Time Memories. It's great. I'm not blowing smoke at you. It's so well produced. It looks great. It sounds great. Hats off to everybody involved. Seriously.
Yeah, Bobby Lee and Carlito, they do a great job at Rox TV, making us, me and Terry, the two old guys, making us look good. The thing is, the production is, good, very basic in a way. I mean, we don't have the money as like the WWE promote, with the stuff that they do, and they got the footage and stuff like that. So they, can spend hundreds of $1,000s, on an episode where, we don't. We're working on, a minimum, budget.
But you have something that they don't have. They have your photo library.
That's true. But then again, on what is it? What's that other thing? The Dark Side of
the Ring on Vice TV, right?
Yeah.
Right.
But you'll see a lot of my photographs pop up on there also. Like, they get a hold of me and ask me, whenever they're doing their new series, do you have photographs on these guys that we're doing? So I have some stuff on Chris Colt coming up on that episode.
Right. The superstar that never quite made it. Everybody tabbed him as one of the most talented guys, but also one of the, genuinely strangest guys.
He was. I say he's the most unsung greatest wrestler in the history of the business.
Yeah, right up there. So that will be an interesting episode for sure. I mean, all I read about him is the guys who were around at that point say there was nobody like him. He had all the talent in the world. Should have been bigger. That's all I hear about Chris Colt. So
I met him and Ronnie Dupree back in 1967. They were at one of our fan conventions, and I became a friend of theirs ever since. And then when I was working for George Cannon's Superstars of Wrestling, we were filming TV up in Montreal, and George came to me and says, I want you to manage Chris Colt. And it's like, oh my God. And this was before I got to manage the Sheik.
Right.
And it's like, wow, I couldn't wait. But then, George, me and Chris were sitting down and, he pitched the idea to Chris and Chris nixed the whole idea. He didn't want me to be doing, he wanted to do his own promos, even though our styles mixed because he was into that rock and roll and the Alice Cooper, makeup, and I was into the, rock star clothes and all that kind of stuff. So I thought we would have gelled pretty good. But in the end, I understood he wanted to do his own thing. He didn't want anybody else taking off a little bit of his limelight, so I understood. But, that's an opportunity that, I wish I had, but it didn't come to fruition.
I'll segue off to somebody you just brought up. When it comes to underrated minds in wrestling history, George Crybaby Cannon is maybe one of the 5 most underrated people who ever worked in the business because he was so influential, not only in Canada, but with Pedro Martinez down in the NWF and other areas. He really was. When people needed somebody to give a little authenticity to their shows, they usually called George Cannon and had him work in the territory. And do you agree with that, or?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'll start first as a wrestler. Oh my God, he was mainly mid card.
Right.
I'll give him that. But his Crybaby Cannon gimmick was amazing.
Mm-hmm.
He was an accomplished wrestler, of course. But when the heel or when the baby face got him down and he started crying in the ring, the audience popped like you couldn't. You almost had to cover your ears because everybody was laughing and cheering and so as a wrestler greatly accomplished.
Yeah.
As a manager, his promos were, oh my God, I learned so much.
Great promos.
Even, when I was, becoming a manager, George, helped me, on my promos, tried to tell me how to say things, how not to say things. And then when you're out at the ring, when to get involved and when not to get involved, because you don't want to take, the light off the match, the story that they're telling, because a manager could, break that heat, instantly. Okay, because if, fans know if a wrestling manager is going to get anywhere close to, the opponent, he's going to grab his tights, he's going to grab his foot or something like that. And it's like George said, don't, because, you're going to take away from the storytelling in the ring. What you want to do is go up and pretend that you're going to do that and let the crowd, trying to tell the referee, hey, watch that manager. He's going to do something, so that was, you get more heat by not doing something than doing something.
Right.
And then, George, when he, great promoter.
Yeah,
great commentator on his shows for superstars
right,
of wrestling.
He could flip that switch. After all those years of being a heel manager, he could become an authority figure or a commissioner type just as easily. He had that authoritative way about him.
And he was the booker for the IWA, the Eddie Einhorn, shows. So Mastermind there brought a lot of the really Detroit and Cleveland NWF talent, into that,
right.
Until that folded. And then he started the Superstars of Wrestling thing and promoting shows all across Ontario and Quebec. Just a mastermind.
Yeah, I remember.
He was great.
I remember Dick the Bruiser bringing him in the mid '80s too. I don't know what he was doing there, but he did some spots in Indiana, '85-ish. He was doing some color commentary and he was doing some interviews backstage. I think they brought him in just because he was a good authority figure, somebody who would talk wrestling. Yeah. I remember he had an interview segment where he would talk about Hulk Hogan and stuff. I'm like, how is he getting away with this? But he was. So it was like, but it was George Cannon who had that vibe about him as a real expert. So he's just underrated in my book. Plus, the first time I ever saw him, he used to wear this kind of ring jacket with a plastic-looking baseball helmet.
Oh, the helmet.
And on the back of the jacket, it would say, Cannon, I am right.
Yep, exactly.
That sticks with you, It had an impression on me as a kid.
Yep. That's the way everybody remembers George as a manager around here.
Mm-hmm. Cannon, I am right.
Yep, I am right.
Totally original. And he's a Hall of Famer in my book. And so are you.
Yep.
So are you. What a career you've had. I mean, starting out as a 12-year-old photographer and fan club guy and working your way to become the manager of the Sheik and becoming a media member in your own right, and you're still writing and you're still active. How do you look back in your wrestling life? What do you think? All I know is I spent 6 years with Pro Wrestling Illustrated, and people remember me for that, and I'm eternally grateful for it because I walked away from it around 95, and I didn't think anybody cared. As I'm turning out decades later, people still remember it and still care. I think people probably feel that way about you too. How do you look back at your wrestling career now, all these years later?
I'm like one of the most blessed kids.
Yep.
Teenager, into my managing career. I'm the most, I don't know anybody who's been more blessed than I have.
Mm-hmm.
Did I make a ton of money at it? No. And the thing, we talked about earlier on ourselves is that, for a manager, you're mainly a lot of the managers who worked in wrestling worked their own little territories. I mean, like Dr. Ken Ramey, he only worked down south.
Right.
He didn't work New York or out in LA and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Myself, I worked, Michigan, Ohio, Ontario, mainly. But then again, George Cannon's Superstars program went all, from ocean to ocean in Canada. So I was well known, from, Nova Scotia to Vancouver. But, wrestling managers, that mainly worked in their own little territory in the day. The first person who, broke that sort of mold was Ernie Roth. He was Abdullah Farouk here, in this territory.
Right.
And then he went to New York as the Grand Wizard, and then not until like the 80s, did Gary Hart go from Texas to Atlanta and started working other territories. Jim Cornette, he was, very fortunate also to go with the Midnight Express into different territories. The Midnight Express wouldn't go without Jimmy.
Right.
So, I'm, mainly, I don't say I'm famous. I don't say I'm a legend. I don't say, I'm a Hall of Famer or anything like that. But, I've been very fortunate. And, people in this area, in this territory probably know who I am. But, you get the fans from, LA and, Texas and, Florida. They probably have no idea who I was. They probably read my articles and they've seen my photographs, and hopefully now some of the younger fans have seen our shows. But all I can say is, I feel very blessed. I thank all the guys, that took me in as a young kid, guys, like, the Sheik and Bobo and, Kurt Von Hess. And I'll say this about Kurt Von Hess. We're coming up in a couple days if it's 25 years since he passed. And I did a small article for Paige that she's going to post on, this coming Wednesday.
Guess what I did too. Because like I said, Kurt was the first villain that ever scared me back in 1970.
Yeah. So, and then, probably not today because it's getting a little late and, getting almost past my bedtime. I just got in the mail today, Ringside, How We Made I Like to Hurt People. It's the new DVD. It's not, I Like to Hurt People, but it's all the footage that, didn't make it into the original movie, by Brian Greenberg. So, if any of your fans, are, fans of I Like to Hurt People, here's a new one of how it was made. I haven't seen it yet, but it's available on eBay, $19.99. Grab it, pick it up. It's great.
Yeah, get it while you can.
The other thing I can say is, I know you've read it, but I don't know how many of, the fans listening to your show, if they haven't, if you're a fan of the Sheik, which I am, and I helped Brian Solomon, a bit on, his book, but to me, it's the greatest research wrestling book I have read.
Brian Solomon book? Absolutely. I mean, yeah. I told him, we've been on each other's podcasts, and I told him, this is the book I've waited my whole life to read about the Sheik. How he even found some of these facts and figures, I have no earthly idea. But he did it over a long period of time too. He didn't rush it.
Yep.
That's the beauty part about it. He really got everything down. And I'll tell you what, considering that most of his contemporaries are gone, what a job, right? I mean, seriously,
Exactly.
That's why it won all these awards. It's won is because I think a lot of fans felt the same way. It's the book we've all waited. The Sheik was an enigma. You worked with him, but he remains an enigma to this day. There was nobody like the Sheik. There's nobody who lived this gimmick like the Sheik. There's nobody who went over like he did. There's nobody who was as violent as he was. He was a trailblazer in so many different ways that I still find him utterly fascinating in every way. And the fact that you're still around to talk about it and that Brian came up with that book. I mean, the Sheik's probably more popular now than he was. Well, he got popular again in the early 90s when he was doing Japan and, he did those tours and those really ultra violent matches over there. But the Sheik's having a revival. I wish he was here to see it.
Yeah. And the greatest thing, like I said, Brian's research was like unprecedented in any wrestling book I've ever read. And like you said, the contemporaries, the Bobos and all the guys that he ever worked with, besides a few guys like, Terry Funk, who were still alive at the time of the book writing, and a few others, they weren't around to tell their Sheik stories. And more than anything, the Sheik's family was not involved in all. They didn't want anything to do with the book. From what, Brian told me, Eddie Farhat Jr. basically flat out refused unless he paid him, an exorbitant amount of money, to interview him for the book. And, basically Brian wasn't going to do that. And I told him that, probably 90% of the stuff he's going to tell you is probably false and, the myths anyway.
I'm glad the book came out. It's such an important piece of wrestling history, and you're part of that. I mean, you really are. I mean, how many people can say this? And I'm glad that I want people to discover you even now. I wish there was more videotape though of you as a manager. I really find that to be, because were you ever on TV in Detroit and all that stuff? I can't place the years with your tenure. Is there a lot of videotape of you out there doing your manager thing or no?
There's very little.
Yeah.
The stuff that I would be on TV in Detroit was when I was on, George Cannon Superstars.
Right.
Because that, came on in Windsor, just across from Detroit. And then, other stuff that I did was when Louis Martinez and Ron Martinelli had their little promotion. We bought airtime on the Sheik's Big Time Wrestling show, and George Cannon did the promos for us. So, and I have a lot of videotape of myself, but it's on VHS tapes, and basically I look at it as who's going to care. There's stuff on, with me and the Kangaroos and Mickey Doyle. I've got great interview stuff with Al Snow.
Okay. Now here's where I think you're wrong, because people are flocking to YouTube video archive people like Dave Dynasty, who does the WWA, and Chris P. Lettuce, who has federations. I was in the business and I haven't heard of some of the videotapes he's got on YouTube. And I'm looking at the view counts on these things, and they're in the thousands. So somebody cares, my friend. And I think of more people than you think. I'm telling you. I care. Yeah. I care. That's why I have you on the show. I'm in awe of your career and your accomplishments. And now I can say I've had both Terry Sullivan and Supermouth Dave Drason on my show. I couldn't be prouder. And I'm serious about that.
Okay, checks in mail, Bob.
No, I mean it. You guys... For a lot of reasons. Number one, you again, to be able to talk to someone who worked with the Sheik. Oh, I did have, before I let you go, I had a legitimate conversation with the Sheik. This is funny. Are you ready for this?
Go ahead.
I'm in Philadelphia working for PWI, and Joe Goodhart had his Tri-State Wrestling Federation, and he's got a huge main event, a cage match between Abdullah the Butcher and an aging Sheik, right? This is around 91, I guess, somewhere between 89 and 91. He calls me, Joel Goodhart does. We were close, and he says, Bob, if you're going to come, and I want you to be here to cover the show, I want you to get a tuxedo and wear it at ringside. I said, what? He said, we're all going to be wearing tuxedos because of the, we want to look major league, la-di-da. So I'm thinking about this. I want to shut off for a tuxedo for wrestling. And I went, yeah, okay, Joel, I'll do it. So I'm in the backstage corridor because, I had to go anywhere I wanted. I was part of the crew, basically. And I feel a hand on my shoulder. And I spin around and it's Sheik. And he goes, what time is bell? And I realized he thought I was Joel Goodhart. Because we both had longish hair and a beard. And we were both wearing tuxedos. We looked very similar at that time. So I think he thought I was Joel. And I went, oh, sir, you, Mr. Sheik, or whatever I called him. I said, you're looking for Joel. I'm not Joel, but I know where Joel is, and I'll get Joel for you. He goes, oh, thank you very much. And he was very cordial. But he actually put his hand on my shoulder, thinking I was the promoter. And I think he just had a very simple question, like, what time is the bell? What time, are we starting? I'll never forget it. How many people would the Sheik actually try to talk to? Even in 1991, right? I mean, he was still living that Sheik life. If people talk to this day about him chasing people around the Philadelphia hotel with a saber, because he was a Sheik, man.
Well, even when I was managing him, I had a good friend of mine, Charlie, who came along with me to the shows because he was a photographer.
Mm-hmm.
And, I had, him take pictures of me, pose stuff of me and the Sheik, and, outside the dressing room. Sheik never spoke to him, wouldn't say a word.
Right.
He kept the kayfabe with him.
Yeah. Yeah. And, one of John Arizzi's conventions, he had the Sheik there and he stayed.
Yeah.
I mean, he was scaring people. He had that big machete or saber or whatever it was. He was smacking it against the table. And it was like, people were afraid to get his autograph, even though we were paying for it. Was there ever a more effective heel than Ed Farhat? I mean, come on. I mean, he could, the fans parted when he walked down the aisle. You were there. I mean, it was like, they don't do that anymore. It's like nobody had that spell over an audience, so to speak, the way the Sheik had. He was one of a kind. He really was.
Oh, I can't tell you the amount of times that, somebody, would stand up and, want to, point their finger out and yell at him or something. All he had to do was make a half step jerk toward him. And they were like 3 rows, jumping 3 rows back in their seats. He could make a crowd, part better than, Moses parting the Red Sea, no doubt about it. The greatest heel of all time.
Oh yeah. I mean,
the only thing that really ticks me off these days is that, there's times I meet wrestling fans and stuff like that, or people who find out that I was in the business. Oh, what did you do? Oh, he managed the Sheik. Oh, you managed the Iron Sheik? And it's like, I shut him off right there.
Right.
I won't even say nothing.
I understand because, listen, the Iron Sheik was great, but the Sheik, the fact that you have to call him the original Sheik bugs me too, but that's just, the way things go. But you know what? He was wrestling. I mean, he's such a standard for heels that I don't think anybody will ever. The only one I put him, I put Fred Blassie as 1A, as 2 guys who were so real, and that's the word, real. I know the fire throwing and all that. People go, how the heck did he do that? Not even the point. The point is he drew people to arenas to see his mysticism, his evil leer, his foaming at the mouth, his, you knew somebody was going to bleed in the match because that was the Sheik, and you couldn't get that everywhere. It was still kind of unique.
Blassie in L.A., he was God out there.
Yes, he was.
But you get him in, like when he was in New York, I mean, he wasn't He was mid-card,
But
nothing.
but you know what? Seriously, his last run, and I was around it. I'm this old, okay? His last run was late 72 into late 73. And he
Okay.
went over huge then. He was promoted as the vampire for Blassie there. He went back to his villainous ways. After, the reason he faded right then and there is, well, first of all, California banned him from wrestling because he was 55. He was too old. There was a law or something. He couldn't. So he came to the East Coast, and his knees were shot. He was done, and he knew it. So they gave him one last run against Pedro Morales and that whole crew there, and he had another feud with Bobo, and that was it for Fred. And then I think late 74 he became a manager in the East Coast, and that was the rest of his career. But no, he was still main eventing, but it didn't last long. They brought him in this, horribly violent, bloody TV jobber matches, and it didn't run longer than 6 months because he was pretty much through. He just was.
Yeah, the last I saw him and stuff was out in L.A. The summer of 1973. I went out and worked in the L.A. office.
Mm-hmm.
Don Wilson brought me out there, and I got to work with Jeff Walton and Larry Korn and Bob Kubik and Jules Strongbow, and
wow,
I had a great 3 months out there with the Sheik's blessing.
Yeah.
Sheik called Mike LaBelle and said, "Hey, take care of my boy out there," and he did. And I saw Blassie and Blassie and Tolis. They had a big blow off thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I got to know both of them real well out there. And I have photographs of them in the dressing room before the match, together, shaking hands, happy as could be. And then after the match, both of them bloody as all get out, going at each other, and then bloody, shaking each other, and hands and, arms around each other. So I had, both sides of both guys, on one, on photographs that, I think I threw them out there a couple here and there now, but, they trusted me never to have those photographs shown back then.
There you go. That was your reputation, I'll tell you. Let us not forget, too, was it 69 or 70, the Sheik Blassie cage match in California, the one that turned Blassie fan favorite?
Yep.
Right. That's one of the most historic matches. They called it the Blassie cage back then, and it was a really, really big deal. I mean, that was the thing with Blassie in California. The 71 feud with Tolis and the one with the Sheik, those were huge box office.
Yeah, and that's the one where they had they brought Ernie Roth out there as Abdullah Farouk, and they had him in the shark
cage up in the sky.
Yeah.
Oh, that was great. And again,
I heard about.
I only saw it in the magazines. I hadn't. These things. There's no tape of any of this. It's such a shame, But nobody could foresee the videotape era, or the VHS era, or any of that stuff. It was all you had to be there.
Well, here's the thing on that one too. You mentioned about videotapes that I was on. It was years ago when I saw Johnny Powers. We were at the Titans in Toronto, a reunion. And, he remembered me as a kid and stuff, and we got to talking old stuff. And he says, "Hey, I seen you on, George Cannon's Superstars." I says, "Yeah, I wish I, could see those things." He said, "I own all the tapes."
Good.
And it's like, really?
Really?
I said, "Man, it'd be great to see those." He says, "You want to buy them?" So they were on these, what is it, the 2-inch tapes or 1 inch and a half, 3/4 inch
the
tapes?
U-matic, I think they call them, right? The TV tapes?
Yeah. Yeah, they were like, the cassette ones,
right,
but they were still like 3/4 inch.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, "I want $40,000 for the catalog." And it's like, well, first of all, I'm not going to give you $40,000 for, all those tapes. And second of all, it would cost me 10 times as much to try to convert them, because no TV station across the country still has those kinds of machines.
I personally know a guy here in the Long Island area that does that kind of work, and it ain't cheap. It's not cheap at all. I mean, it's really expensive.
I mean, I have, tapes, the big real ones, the 2-inch tapes.
Right.
That, I have interviews of mine, my practice interviews that I talked about that, Sheik did with me. I have a bunch of those on that 2-inch tape, but I've never been able to find anybody who can convert them for me.
Well, this is a big moment for me. I've always wanted to meet you, and I hope our paths cross in real time sometime rather than just here looking at each other on video. This is Dave Drason, the Supermouth, Dave Burzyinski. You're one of my heroes, man. I mean that sincerely. As a photographer, as a journalist, the whole 9 yards. I read your stuff for years before I started. I knew who you were when I was a staffer with PWI. And do you ever sell to those guys?
No.
You never sold to London. I saw your stuff everywhere, though.
Yeah. Let's see. I did Wrestling Review, Wrestling World, Monthly, Ring Wrestling, Big Book of Wrestling.
Everything else.
The Aftermags. Yeah.
Yeah, the early. You were in the Aftermags, though. I think. Yeah, that counts.
Yep.
That's the same thing. Anything that Stanley Weston published, I put that all in the same umbrella. So you're one of the most prolific wrestling photographers in my mind of all time. You've done a lot for the business, and I'm glad the business has done a lot for you. And I'm very proud to have you on the show. I hope the listeners enjoyed this as much as I enjoyed it, because I'm having a blast, and I wish we didn't have to stop. That's the way I'm going to say it.
Well, I'll say this about you, Bob. Great interview, very respectful. I thank you very much about that. And more than anything, I look forward, only because you and I found out we're both musicians.
Right.
And we both love the blues.
Mm-hmm.
And you're going to send me CDs of your career singing blues. And I really look forward to that.
Yeah, I'm really proud of it. It's I did it for real. I'm not going to hype this stuff here on this show, but I had a nice career. I really did. Really did. I mean, I did stuff that most normal people don't get to do. So it was like, it was a lot of fun in the blues world. But I always say, when you're a blues musician, you might as well play polkas, because it's like there's very little mainstream acknowledgement or knowledge about blues music. But the people who are into it are really into it. It's kind of like old school wrestling, right?
Yeah, exactly.
In the 70s, wrestling wasn't cool with, if you want, it wasn't a good date night. We'll put it that way. But if you were into it, you were really into it. Like you and I were.
Yeah.
So it's.
Well, you get guys like B.B. King and Albert Collins and Hound Dog Taylor and so many of the other greats, those great blues guitarists and singers in the 70s. They were lucky to sell a couple hundred, 1,000, CDs or something, back then. Now they're revered as legends, and, guys wanted to play with them, and they're covering their songs.
Well, I will say this, and I have a connection there. A big key to B.B. King's career was his manager, Sid Seidenberg. And Sid realized that the young British rockers and the young British guitarists all revered B.B. King. So Sid got B.B. to open for the Rolling Stones and other major rock acts, opened up a whole new audience to B.B. King, and he became a star that way. And that's a stroke of genius. Instead of playing the little clubs, he had them opening at Madison Square Garden for the Rolling Stones.
Well,
is that smart or what?
Right? As big as B.B. King was, I wish I could have seen him in a match against the Sheik. But he was like a pre-Abdullah the Butcher.
Well, I don't want to blow my own horn, but I'll leave you with this. If you go to my Facebook page, right? I think we're friends on Facebook.
Yep.
Find the main page. I'm singing with B.B. King right on the top.
Cool.
I wouldn't trade that photo for anything in the world, my friend.
Hey, I thank you for this interview. You're like one of my new heroes, Bob. I thank you for your respect. I thank you for all your compliments. Thank you for watching our shows and, promoting.
Before I let you go, one more time, the Cooks Tour, where can they find you? Both anywhere, Facebook, the videos, just give them hype everything you're doing.
Basically, Dave Drason Burzynski on Facebook. Our wrestling page, 50s, 60s, 70s, and more, big time wrestling. Come and join us there. Out of Canada, I help a guy with the Sheik magazine archive. That's basically on the Facebook thing. I'll say this: you're going to be the first one to hear about this one. I've got a thing coming up on April 20th. that last year I worked with a gentleman by the name of Tim Kiska, who's big on NPR, National Public Radio. And he's, interviewed myself and Brian Solomon for a piece on the Sheik and big time wrestling. And his season 6 is going to debut at the Detroit Historical Museum. And I'm going to be one of the guests talking, and they're going to debut the show. Another gentleman, a videographer, is putting a new piece together on photographs and video of the Sheik, what you'll be shown at that. That'll be April 20th at the Detroit Historical Museum. I don't know the time and details yet, but you can get a hold of the museum if you want to come. That's the biggest news, on the Sheik that I have right now.
Pretty good.
And it's debuting on your show.
That's pretty good. That's great. And, we're going to get the show on into the podcast waves as soon as we can. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is the Supermouth, Dave Drason, or as we know him here, Dave Burzyinski. Dave, thanks again. A million thanks for being here. This is a high watermark for me. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you, Bob.
Remember when you were 9 years old and it was Christmas morning and you got up really early and you went down and you saw the tree and all the wonderful things underneath it, and you saw something wrapped, you knew it was what you really wanted and you got it? That's how I feel right now. Stuff like this is why I started this podcast. I know I was with PWI from 88 to about 94, 95, whatever the heck it was. And I enjoyed those years, and I really look back at them with nothing but fondness. But my jam is still the days when I was in the 70s and, not in the 70s, but alive in the 1970s, and buying those wrestling magazines and reading about the stars I'd never seen, like the Sheik, like Dave Supermouth Drason, like all these people. And the fact that I'm lucky enough to be able to bump elbows with people like this all these years later. Blessing 1,000 times over. I really mean it. I've got goosebumps sitting here talking to you guys. I cannot tell you the admiration I have for Terry Sullivan, Dave Burzyinski. Go down the list. Hats off to everybody who made our childhoods really exciting through the magic of classic pro wrestling. Find them on YouTube. Find them everywhere they are. You'll thank me later, I'm telling you. So anyway, outdatedwrestlinghour.buzzsprout.com is our website where you can find every single edition of our nostalgia wrestling podcast. Every one of them. They use an app. You can just log on to that site and listen. Outdatedwrestlinghour.buzzsprout.com, where you will find the Outdated Wrestling Hour fan club, where for a nominal fee you can help perpetuate the future of this program. Take part in a Zoom meeting. We're having one very, very soon. If you remember, you know about it. If you're not, you don't. So if you want to know about it, join up. We're going to be giving away a prize. And we're also going to have a lot of fun talking about wrestling, old and new, with each other, face-to-face, through the magic of the interwebs. So anyway, outdatedwrestlinghour.buzzsprout.com for the Outdated Wrestling Hour fan club. Write to us. outdatedwrestling@gmail.com. People are surprised. They always say, hey, answer me back. Well, I'll answer you back as long as you don't say something stupid. But no, seriously, I don't mind conversing. You can also find me at Facebook. I'm Bob Smith. On my page, I'm singing with BB King, as we just spoke about with Dave. So in any event, there's another show in the can. I'm sitting here I feel like having a cigar and put my feet up because I feel like I won the lottery tonight. This kind of stuff is why I do this podcast, and I hope you're enjoying each other talking about old school wrestling. That's it for now. We're going to be back next Friday. We're out every Friday on every podcast app you can name. We're also on YouTube. If you prefer to listen to your podcast on TV or through that app, you can do it. I'm getting hoarse. I've talked so much tonight. My name is Bob Smith. This is the Outdated Wrestling Hour. And as always, I wish you peace and love like the old hippies used to do. I know it's outmoded, but they say classic wrestling's outmoded too. You know what I say to all that? No way, Jack. No way.